The ink moved beneath my fingers like something alive, and in that moment I understood that the dead do not always stay silent. I had never loved my husband. This is the confession I carried through every candlelit corridor of Ashworth Manor, through every whispered condolence and black crepe veil, through every sleepless night when the grandfather clock in the East Wing chimed the hours, and I lay awake wondering if guilt could kill a person as surely as poison. I had married Lord Edmund Ashworth when I was 23 years old, a transaction arranged by my father with the same careful calculation he might have applied to the sale of livestock. My family had a name, but no fortune. Edmund had a fortune, but desired a young wife of good breeding to grace his table and warm his reputation. Love was never part of the negotiation. For 3 years, I played my role with the quiet precision of an actress who has memorized her lines so thoroughly she no longer remembers they are not her own words. I smiled at dinner parties. I nodded at his business associates. I wore the jewels he selected and sat for the portrait he commissioned, and never once complained about the separate bedchambers or the long silences that stretched between us like the fog that rolled in from the Thames each evening. Edmund was not cruel. He was simply absent, even when he stood beside me. He looked at me the way one looks at a well-chosen piece of furniture, with satisfaction, but without passion, without curiosity, without any desire to know what thoughts moved behind my eyes. When he died, I felt many things. Relief, which shamed me. Freedom, which frightened me. And beneath it all, a strange, hollow grief. Not for the man himself, but for the years I had surrendered to a life half-lived. I mourned the woman I might have been if I had been brave enough to refuse my father's arrangement, if I had been reckless enough to believe that love was more important than security. But I had not been brave. I had not been reckless. And now I was 26 years old, draped in widow's weeds, standing in the drawing room of Ashworth Manor while Edmund's relatives gathered like crows around carrion. They despised me. I could see it in their eyes, could hear it in the careful politeness of their voices, could feel it in the way they looked at my black silk gown and my pale face and calculated exactly how much I stood to inherit. Edmund's younger brother, Mr. Geoffrey Ashworth, had barely concealed his contempt since the moment he arrived from his estate in Yorkshire. His wife, Cecilia, watched me with the sharp attention of a woman who has already decided upon her enemy. And Edmund's elderly aunt, Lady Philippa Ashworth, sat in the corner like a spider in her web, her rheumy eyes missing nothing, her thin lips pressed into a line of permanent disapproval. The solicitor, Mr. Bartholomew Crane, was a small, neat man with spectacles that magnified his eyes to an unsettling degree. He had served the Ashworth family for 30 years, and he handled the will with the reverence of a priest handling sacred scripture. The document itself was ordinary enough, cream-colored paper covered in Edmund's familiar cramped handwriting, witnessed and sealed according to all proper legal forms. I remember the way the afternoon light fell through the tall windows, catching motes of dust that floated in the air like tiny ghosts. I remember the smell of the room, beeswax polish and old books, and the faint mustiness that clung to all the heavy velvet drapes. I remember the way my heart beat steadily, without fear, because I had no reason to fear. I had done nothing wrong. I had been a dutiful wife. Whatever Edmund had chosen to leave me, I would accept with the same quiet dignity I had maintained throughout our marriage. Mr. Crane cleared his throat and began to read. The legal language washed over me in waves, provisions and codicils and whereases that meant little to my untrained ear. I heard my name mentioned several times. I heard figures that seemed impossibly large. And then Mr. Crane paused, adjusted his spectacles, and handed me the document itself. It is customary, he explained, for the primary beneficiary to review the original document and confirm its authenticity. I took the will from his hands. The paper was heavier than I expected, thick and slightly rough beneath my fingertips. I looked down at the words, at Edmund's handwriting, at my own name written in his careful script. and the ink began to move. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, a shadow passing across the page. But the letters were rearranging themselves, sliding across the cream-colored paper like insects crawling over skin. My name dissolved, reformed, twisted into something new. The words declaring me Edmund's sole heir melted away, replaced by 4 words that burned themselves into my vision with terrible clarity. You are next. I must have made some sound, some gasp or cry, because suddenly everyone was staring at me. Mr. Crane asked if I was well. Geoffrey demanded to know what was wrong. Lady Philippa's eyes narrowed with suspicion. But when I looked down at the paper again, the words were gone. The will looked exactly as it had before, my name restored, the provisions unchanged, the ink perfectly still and ordinary. I told them I felt faint. I blamed the grief, the strain, the closeness of the room. They accepted my explanation with varying degrees of skepticism, and Mr. Crane completed the reading without further incident. I was, as expected, Edmund's primary heir. The house, the investments, the accounts, all of it passed to me. Geoffrey received a modest bequest. Lady Philippa retained her quarterly allowance. The servants were remembered with small sums appropriate to their years of service. No one else had seen what I had seen. No one else knew that the dead had spoken to me, had warned me, had marked me as their next victim. That night, alone in my chamber, I sat before the mirror and studied my reflection by candlelight. I looked the same as I always had, dark hair pinned back from a face that was pleasant enough but had never been called beautiful, gray eyes that Edmund once described as the color of London rain. I was still young. I was now wealthy. By every measure society used to calculate a woman's worth, I should have been content. But the words haunted me. You are next. What did they mean? Next to die? Next to suffer? Next to discover some terrible truth that had been buried with my husband? I thought of Edmund's first wife. Her name was Adelaide, and she had died 15 years before I ever set foot in Ashworth Manor. Edmund rarely spoke of her, and when he did, his voice took on a strange, distant quality, as though he were describing someone he had read about in a book rather than a woman he had loved. She had been young when they married, younger even than I was. She had been beautiful, according to the portrait that hung in the gallery, with golden hair and eyes the color of spring violets. And she had died suddenly, mysteriously, in this very house. The official cause of death was a fever that took her within 3 days of its onset. But I had heard the servants whisper when they thought I was not listening. They spoke of strange sounds in the night, of doors that opened and closed on their own, of a woman's voice calling from empty rooms. They believed Adelaide's spirit had never left Ashworth Manor. They believed she walked these corridors still, searching for something she had lost, or perhaps for revenge against those who had wronged her. I had dismissed these stories as the superstitious nonsense of uneducated minds. I did not believe in ghosts. I did not believe the dead could reach across the veil that separated their world from ours. But now, sitting in my candle-lit chamber with the memory of moving ink burned into my mind, I was no longer certain what I believed. Sleep eluded me that night. I lay in my bed, listening to the sounds of the old house settling around me, the creak of ancient timbers, the whisper of wind against window panes, the distant chime of the grandfather clock marking each passing hour. Every shadow seemed to shift and move at the edge of my vision. Every draft of cold air felt like the touch of invisible fingers. When morning finally came, gray and drizzling as London mornings so often were, I made a decision. I would not cower in my chamber waiting for death to claim me. I would not allow fear to rule whatever time I had remaining. I would discover the truth behind the warning I had received, even if that truth destroyed me. I needed help. Someone who understood the dark corners of the world where ordinary people feared to look. someone who could distinguish between genuine supernatural phenomena and the tricks of clever frauds, someone who would take my story seriously without dismissing me as a hysterical widow. I needed Julian Vance. I had heard his name whispered in certain drawing rooms, always with a mixture of fascination and unease. He was a private investigator of sorts, though that description failed to capture the true nature of his work. He dealt in mysteries that defied explanation, in cases that the police had abandoned as unsolvable, in questions that respectable society preferred not to ask. He was not received in polite company. His background was obscure, his methods unconventional, his reputation scandalous. Precisely the sort of man a respectable widow should never seek out. I sent him a message that very morning. He arrived 3 days later, on an afternoon when the fog was so thick it seemed to swallow the city whole. I received him in the small parlor, the one Edmund had used for business meetings, with its dark wood paneling and leather chairs and the faint smell of cigars that had seeped into every surface over decades of masculine occupation. I had chosen this room deliberately, wanting to establish from the beginning that this was a professional consultation, nothing more. Mr. Vance was not what I had expected. I had imagined someone theatrical, perhaps, with a dramatic coat and piercing eyes and the manner of a stage mesmerist. Instead, the man who entered my parlor was quiet and composed, of medium height and lean build, with brown hair touched with early gray at the temples, and eyes of a peculiar shade, not quite brown and not quite gold, like amber held up to firelight. He was perhaps 35 years old, dressed in well-made but understated clothing, and he moved with the careful economy of someone who had learned to observe everything while revealing nothing. "Mrs. Ashworth," he said, and his voice was low and measured, without the dramatic flourishes I had half expected. "Thank you for receiving me." I gestured for him to sit, and he chose the chair across from mine, settling into it with the ease of a man accustomed to being in places where he was not entirely welcome. His eyes moved around the room with quick, cataloging intelligence, taking in the furniture, the paintings, the arrangement of objects on the mantelpiece, before finally settling on my face with an attention that felt almost physical. "You wrote that you have experienced something you cannot explain," he said, "something connected to your late husband's will." I told him everything. The reading of the will, the ink that moved beneath my fingers, the words that appeared and vanished before anyone else could see them. I told him about Adelaide, about the servants' whispers, about the 15 years of silence surrounding the first Lady Ashworth's death. I told him about my own marriage, my own guilt, my own fear that perhaps I was being punished for the lovelessness I had brought to Edmund's house. He listened without interrupting, his amber eyes never leaving my face. When I had finished, he was silent for a long moment, and I felt suddenly exposed, as though I had stripped away all my careful armor and stood before him in nothing but my fear. "You believe I am mad," I said, "or lying, or both." "I believe," he replied carefully, "that you saw something that frightened you. Whether that something was supernatural in origin or the product of a clever manipulation designed to achieve a specific end remains to be determined." A manipulation? By whom? For what purpose? He leaned forward slightly, and I caught the scent of him, clean linen and something faintly herbal, rosemary perhaps, or thyme. That is what I propose to discover. But I must be honest with you, Mrs. Ashworth. I am not a spiritualist. I do not conduct seances or commune with the dead. I am an investigator. I look for evidence, for patterns, for the human hands behind seemingly inexplicable events. In my experience, ghosts are far less common than people who wish to make others believe in ghosts. "And if you find evidence that the supernatural is real," I asked, "if you discover that Adelaide's spirit truly does haunt this house?" He held my gaze steadily. "Then I will adjust my understanding accordingly. I am a skeptic, Mrs. Ashworth. But I am not a fool. I know there are more things in heaven and earth than are dreamed of in philosophy. The quotation surprised me, and I felt something shift in my perception of him. This was not a common tradesman or a charlatan seeking to exploit a frightened widow. This was an educated man, a thoughtful man, a man who had chosen to walk a peculiar path for reasons I could not yet fathom. "What do you require from me?" I asked. "Access to the house, permission to speak with the servants, information about your husband's family, his business affairs, anyone who might benefit from your distress or your death. And," he paused, and something flickered in his amber eyes, something that might have been reluctance or might have been concern. "Your trust. Not blind trust, but enough to allow me to do my work without constant obstruction." I considered his words. Trust was not something I gave easily. My marriage had taught me that trust was a currency best hoarded, spent only when absolutely necessary and never without calculation. But I was frightened, truly frightened. In a way I had not been since I was a girl of 18, watching my father sign away my future to a man I had met only twice. "Very well," I said. "You shall have what you need." Thus began my association with Julian Vance, an association that would change everything I thought I knew about myself, about the nature of the world, and about the capacity of the human heart to find love in the most unlikely places. He moved into Ashworth Manor that same week, taking a room in the East Wing where he could conduct his investigations without disturbing the household routines. The servants regarded him with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. Mrs. Blackwood, the housekeeper who had served the family for 40 years, made her disapproval clear through the subtle weapons of domestic warfare, linens that were slightly less fresh than they might have been, meals that arrived lukewarm, fires that were laid but never quite sufficient to warm his rooms. I intervened when I could, but I understood her reluctance. Julian Vance was an outsider, an unknown quantity, a man whose very presence suggested that something was wrong in the house she had dedicated her life to maintaining. Geoffrey and Cecilia had departed for Yorkshire shortly after the reading of the will, their farewells perfunctory and cold. Lady Philippa remained, as she always did, a permanent fixture in the house, like the ancient furniture she resembled. She watched Julian's comings and goings with undisguised hostility, and I knew that rumors would soon be spreading through London society. The widow Ashworth had taken a man into her house, a strange man, an investigator of the occult. The scandal would be delicious, my reputation would be shredded, but I found, somewhat to my surprise, that I did not care. Julian spent his first days examining the house itself, moving through rooms with his notebook in hand, measuring dimensions and testing floorboards and tapping on walls in search of hollow spaces. He questioned the servants with a quiet thoroughness that extracted information they did not know they possessed. He requested access to Edmund's study, to his business papers, to the family correspondence that stretched back generations. I accompanied him on many of these expeditions, partly because I wanted to be involved in the investigation of my own potential murder, and partly, I admit, because I found his company oddly comforting. There was something reassuring about his methodical approach, his refusal to panic, his quiet confidence that every mystery could be solved if one only had patience and attention to detail. One afternoon, we found ourselves in the servants' quarters, interviewing the housemaids about anything unusual they might have noticed since Edmund's death. Most of them had nothing to report, but one girl, a young woman named Mary, who had only been in service for 6 months, grew pale when Julian asked about strange sounds in the night. "I did not want to say anything," she whispered, glancing around as though afraid of being overheard. "Mrs. Blackwood told us not to gossip about such things, but I have heard it, sir. I have heard her." "Her?" Julian asked gently. Mary swallowed hard. "The First Lady Ashworth, her ghost. She walks the east corridor at midnight, sir. I have heard her footsteps, heard her weeping, heard her calling out for someone." She stopped, her eyes filling with tears. "She sounds so sad, sir, so terribly, terribly sad." I felt a chill run down my spine, that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. "Have you seen anything?" I asked. "Any figure? Any shadow?" "No, madam, only heard." "But—" Mary hesitated, biting her lip. "There is one thing more. I did not know if I should mention it, but since you are asking about strange occurrences—" She took a breath. "3 nights ago, I was coming up the back stairs very late. I had been in the kitchen, heating milk for my cough, and I saw a light in the gallery, moving along as though someone was carrying a candle. But when I looked more closely, there was no one there. The light just vanished, like a flame being snuffed out." Julian and I exchanged glances. He thanked Mary for her courage in speaking to us, assured her that she would not be punished for sharing what she knew, and sent her back to her duties. When she was gone, he turned to me with a thoughtful expression. "A moving light in the gallery," he mused, "where Adelaide's portrait hangs. You think there is a connection? I think," he said slowly, "that someone is moving through this house at night, using paths and methods we have not yet discovered. Whether that someone is a ghost or a living person remains to be determined." That evening, Julian proposed that we keep watch in the gallery, waiting to see if the light appeared again. I agreed immediately, grateful for any action that might bring us closer to the truth. Mrs. Blackwood packed us a basket with sandwiches and hot tea, asking no questions, though her raised eyebrows spoke volumes, and we settled ourselves in a small alcove at the far end of the gallery where we could observe without being seen. The hours passed slowly. We spoke in whispers, sharing fragments of our lives, our histories, our hopes and fears. Julian told me of his childhood in a small village in Kent, of his mother who had died when he was 12, of his father who had been a schoolmaster and had instilled in him a love of books and learning. He told me of his years at Oxford, where he had studied philosophy and history, and of the moment when he had first encountered a case that defied all rational explanation, a moment that had changed the course of his life forever. I told him of my own girlhood, of the father who had seen me only as currency to be traded, of the mother who had loved me but had been powerless to protect me. I told him of my wedding day, of the cold fear that had settled in my stomach as I spoke vows I did not mean, of the years of loneliness that had followed. I found myself speaking of things I had never told anyone, secrets I had kept locked away in the deepest chambers of my heart, and Julian listened without judgment, without interruption, with a compassion that made my throat ache. "You deserved better," he said quietly when I had finished. "You deserved a life of passion and purpose, not one of duty and despair." I smiled, though I could feel tears threatening at the corners of my eyes. Perhaps. But we do not always get what we deserve. We get what circumstances and choices give us, and we make the best of it. Is that what you are doing now? Making the best of it? I considered his question. "I suppose I am," I said at last. "For the first time in my life, I feel as though I have some control over my own fate. I may be in danger, but at least I am facing that danger on my own terms. At least I am not simply waiting for someone else to decide my future." He reached out and took my hand, a gesture so natural and unthinking that it took us both by surprise. His fingers were warm around mine, strong and gentle at the same time. "You are remarkable," he said. "I hope you know that." Before I could respond, a sound echoed through the gallery, the creak of a floorboard, followed by another and another, approaching slowly from the far end of the corridor. Julian dropped my hand and reached for his pistol. I pressed myself back into the shadows of the alcove, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure whoever was approaching must be able to hear it. A figure emerged from the darkness, carrying a small lamp that cast a flickering circle of light on the floor. For one wild moment, I thought it was Adelaide herself, risen from the grave to deliver her warning in person. But as the figure drew closer, I recognized the stooped shoulders and shuffling gait of Lady Philippa. She stopped before Adelaide's portrait and raised her lamp, illuminating the painted face. For a long moment, she simply stood there, gazing up at the woman who had been dead for 15 years. And then, So softly I almost missed it. She began to speak. "I am sorry," she murmured. "I know you cannot hear me. I know you cannot forgive me. But I want you to know that I am sorry. Every day, every hour, every moment, I am sorry." Julian and I remained frozen in our alcove, scarcely daring to breathe. Lady Philippa continued her strange vigil for several more minutes, sometimes speaking in fragments too quiet to hear, sometimes simply staring at the portrait with an expression of such profound grief that I felt my own eyes sting with tears. Then, as suddenly as she had come, she turned and shuffled away, disappearing into the darkness at the far end of the gallery. When we were sure she was gone, Julian and I emerged from our hiding place. His face was troubled in the lamplight. "She knows something," he said. "Something about Adelaide's death. Her guilt was written on her face. She was apologizing to a dead woman," I said, "asking for forgiveness, which suggests that she played some role in Adelaide's fate." Julian frowned, thinking. But what role? And why? After 15 years, does she still come here at night to ask forgiveness of a portrait? I did not have an answer, but I knew, with a certainty that settled cold and heavy in my stomach, that Lady Philippa was far more than the disapproving elderly aunt she pretended to be. She was a keeper of secrets, and some of those secrets, I was beginning to fear, might have the power to destroy me. I watched him work, and I found myself drawn to his methodical intensity. Here was a man who approached mysteries not with fear, but with fascination, who saw in the unknown not a threat, but a puzzle to be solved. He spoke to me each evening over dinner, sharing his findings and his theories, asking questions that revealed the sharpness of his mind. And slowly, incrementally, I began to feel something I had not expected. I began to feel safe. It was an unfamiliar sensation, safety. I had not felt it in my father's house, where I was always conscious of being a burden, a daughter when a son was wanted, a mouth to feed when resources were scarce. I had not felt it in my marriage, where I was always performing, always measuring my words and actions against some invisible standard of wifely perfection. But in Julian's company, I found I could speak freely. I could ask questions. I could express doubts and fears and half-formed thoughts without worrying that I was exposing some shameful weakness. He treated me as an equal. This, more than anything, was what drew me to him. He did not condescend or patronize. He did not assume that my sex rendered me incapable of understanding complex matters. He explained his reasoning and invited my opinions and listened, truly listened when I spoke. It was intoxicating, this respect, this recognition of my intelligence. It was a gift I had not known I craved until it was offered. On the 4th night of his residence, Julian asked me to show him Adelaide's portrait. She hung in the long gallery, surrounded by generations of Ashworth ancestors in their heavy gilt frames. The gallery was rarely used, a dim corridor that connected the old wing of the house to the new, lined with windows that looked out over the formal gardens. In daylight, it was merely gloomy. At night, by candlelight, it felt like walking through a tomb. Julian held his candle high, illuminating Adelaide's face. She had been beautiful, there was no denying it. The artist had captured something vital in her expression, a spark of life and intelligence that made her seem almost ready to step out of the frame and speak. Her golden hair was arranged in the elaborate style of 15 years past, and she wore a gown of pale blue silk that set off the unusual color of her eyes. She was very young, I said. Younger than I am now. 19 when she married Edmund, Julian replied. 21 when she died. I found the records in the parish register. And the cause of death? Fever, according to the official documentation. But, he turned to look at me, and his amber eyes were troubled in the flickering light. I spoke with Mrs. Blackwood this afternoon. She was here when Adelaide died. She was one of the servants who attended her during her final illness. What did she tell you? He was silent for a moment, choosing his words with care. She told me that Adelaide did not die of fever. She told me that Adelaide was frightened, terrified in the days before her death. She believed someone in the house meant her harm. She begged Mrs. Blackwood to help her escape, to send word to her family, to do anything that might save her. And then, 3 days later, she was dead. A chill ran through me that had nothing to do with the cold of the gallery. You believe she was murdered? I believe it is possible. Julian turned back to the portrait, studying Adelaide's painted face with intense concentration. The question is, by whom? And why? And most importantly, is the same person now threatening you? We stood together in the candle-lit darkness, gazing at the face of a woman who had died 15 years before my arrival in this house. I thought about her fear, her desperate pleas for help, the silence that had swallowed her final days. Had she known she was going to die? Had she felt the same creeping dread that now haunted my own nights? There is something else, Julian said quietly. Something Mrs. Blackwood told me that I have not yet been able to verify. Tell me. He hesitated, and I saw something in his expression that I had not seen before. Uncertainty, perhaps, or the shadow of something darker. She said that on the night Adelaide died, she saw something in this gallery. A figure standing before this portrait, looking up at Adelaide's face. A figure that vanished when Mrs. Blackwood approached, dissolving into shadows as though it had never been there at all. A ghost, I whispered. Perhaps. Or perhaps someone who did not wish to be seen. Julian's voice was steady, but I could hear the strain beneath it. He was a skeptic, he had told me. He believed in evidence and logic and the human capacity for deception. But even skeptics, I was learning, could be shaken by stories told in darkened galleries by candlelight. I found myself reaching out, my fingers brushing the canvas of Adelaide's portrait. The paint was cool beneath my touch, dry and ancient, yet I half expected to feel warmth, to feel the pulse of a living woman trapped within the frame. Her painted eyes seemed to follow me, seemed to hold questions she could not ask and answers she could not give. Mr. Vance, I said, have you ever encountered something truly unexplainable? Something that your logic and evidence could not resolve? He was silent for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice held a quality I had not heard before, a vulnerability that surprised me. Once, he said. Many years ago. A case that still troubles me. Tell me. He turned away from the portrait, and in the candlelight, his profile was sharp, almost severe. There was a woman, he said slowly, a young widow, not unlike yourself. She came to me with a similar story, strange occurrences in her home, warnings she could not explain. I investigated, found nothing, dismissed her fears as hysteria. 3 weeks later, she was dead. My breath caught. And you blame yourself. I blame my certainty, he replied. My arrogance. I was so sure that there was nothing supernatural in the world, so committed to my rational explanations, that I refused to see what was before my eyes. I do not know even now whether she was murdered by human hands or by something else entirely. But I know that my dismissal contributed to her death. Is that why you took my case? I asked. Because you saw in me an echo of her? He turned to face me, and his amber eyes were dark with old pain. Perhaps. Or perhaps I simply recognized in you someone who deserved to be believed. Someone whose story, however strange, held the ring of truth. We stood together in the flickering candlelight, surrounded by the painted faces of generations of Ashworths, and I felt something shift between us. A connection, fragile and new, like the first green shoot of spring pushing through frozen soil. We returned to the main part of the house in silence, each lost in our own thoughts. At the door to my chamber, Julian paused. Mrs. Ashworth, he said, and his formality felt suddenly like a barrier, a wall he was constructing between us to maintain proper distance. I want you to know that I will do everything in my power to discover the truth and to keep you safe. But I must also warn you that the truth, when we find it, may not be comforting. It may be painful. It may require you to see people you know in a different light." "I understand," I said. "And Mr. Vance?" "Yes?" I met his eyes, and I let him see what I had been trying to hide, the fear, the loneliness, the desperate hope that had brought me to seek his help. "Thank you for believing me, for not dismissing me as a hysterical woman." Something shifted in his expression, a softening that he quickly suppressed. "I would never dismiss you, Mrs. Ashworth. You are one of the most clear-headed people I have encountered in my work. Whatever is happening in this house, I do not for a moment believe it is a product of your imagination." He turned and walked away down the corridor, and I watched him go with a strange ache in my chest. I told myself it was gratitude, nothing more. I told myself that the warmth I felt when he looked at me was simply the relief of being taken seriously after years of being overlooked. I told myself many things that night, lying alone in my cold bed while the wind howled outside my window. I told myself everything except the truth. The following weeks passed in a rhythm of investigation and discovery. Julian interviewed servants, examined documents, and traced the history of the Ashworth family back through generations. I assisted where I could, searching through Edmund's papers for any mention of Adelaide, any hint of what had happened in the months before her death. What we found was disturbing. Adelaide, it seemed, had not been the placid, contented wife that Edmund had implied in his rare mentions of her. According to letters we discovered hidden in a locked drawer of Edmund's desk, she had been deeply unhappy in her marriage. She had written to her sister, begging to be allowed to return home, describing her husband as cold and controlling, describing the house as a prison from which she saw no escape. The letters had never been sent. Edmund must have intercepted them, read them, and kept them for reasons I could not fathom. There was more. Financial records showed that Adelaide had possessed a substantial inheritance from her grandmother, an inheritance that had passed to Edmund upon her death. Medical records, obtained through channels Julian declined to explain, revealed that the physician who had certified Adelaide's death from fever had been a man heavily in debt to the Ashworth family, a debt that was mysteriously forgiven shortly after Adelaide's burial. The picture that emerged was damning. A young wife, unhappy and perhaps afraid, dying suddenly under suspicious circumstances, her wealth passing to a husband who had every reason to wish her gone. But Edmund was dead now, beyond the reach of justice, beyond the possibility of confession or denial. Whatever sins he had committed, he had carried them to his grave. Yet someone was still threatening me. The warnings did not stop after that first incident with the will. They came in small ways, subtle ways, easy to dismiss as coincidence or imagination. A book left open on my nightstand to a passage about poison. A dead bird on my windowsill, its neck twisted at an unnatural angle. Words appearing in the steam on my mirror after my bath, the same 3 words that haunted my dreams. You are next. Julian documented each incident with meticulous care, searching for evidence of human interference, for the mechanisms by which these seeming supernatural events might have been accomplished. He found some explanations. The book, he discovered, had been moved by one of the housemaids while dusting, an innocent coincidence. The dead bird had been left by a cat that had somehow gotten into the house through an open window. But the words on the mirror, the ink that had moved beneath my fingers, these remained mysteries he could not solve. "I am missing something," he said one evening, frustration clear in his voice. We sat in the small parlor where we had first met, the fire burning low, the candles guttering in their holders. There must be a rational explanation. There must be someone in this house, or with access to this house, who wishes to frighten you. "To what end?" I asked. "The will has been read. I have inherited. Frightening me gains nothing. Unless," Julian said slowly, thinking aloud, "unless the goal is not to prevent your inheritance, but to drive you away, to make this house so unbearable that you choose to leave. Leave and go where? That is the question." He leaned back in his chair, his amber eyes reflecting the firelight. If you were to die, who would inherit? If you were to abandon the house, who would benefit? Geoffrey, I said, Edmund's brother. The estate is entailed. If I die without children, Geoffrey inherits everything. And if you simply leave? If you retreat to the country, or travel abroad, or take up residence elsewhere, the house would stand empty. Or, I paused, thinking through the implications. Or Geoffrey might petition to have himself named as steward, managing the estate in my prolonged absence. Julian nodded. It is a possibility. I need to learn more about Mr. Geoffrey Ashworth, his financial situation, his relationship with his brother, his whereabouts during the incidents you have experienced. He is in Yorkshire, I said. He left after the funeral. So he claims. But Yorkshire is not so far that a determined man could not travel back and forth without being noticed. The idea that Geoffrey might be responsible for my torment was both comforting and disturbing. Comforting because it offered a human explanation, a motive I could understand, a threat I could potentially counter. Disturbing because it meant that I was surrounded by enemies, that even the bonds of family meant nothing in the face of greed. Julian left for Yorkshire 3 days later. The morning of his departure was gray and wet, a thin drizzle falling from a sky the color of old pewter. I stood at the window of the front parlor and watched his carriage disappear into the fog, and I felt something I had not expected to feel. A sense of loss, an ache in my chest that had nothing to do with the investigation or my own safety. He had kissed my hand before he left, a gesture that was perfectly proper and yet somehow charged with meaning that went beyond mere courtesy. Be careful, he had said, his amber eyes holding mine with an intensity that made my breath catch. Trust no one until I return. Lock your door at night. Send word immediately if anything happens. I will, I had promised, and you must take care as well. The roads are treacherous in this weather. I have survived worse than English rain, Mrs. Ashworth. He had smiled then, a rare, full smile that transformed his face. I will return as quickly as I can. And then he was gone, swallowed by the fog and the drizzle and the endless gray of the London morning, and I was alone. His absence was harder than I had anticipated. I had grown accustomed to his presence in the house, to our evening conversations, to the sound of his footsteps in the corridor outside my chamber. Without him, Ashworth Manor felt larger and darker and more oppressive than ever. The shadows seemed to deepen. The creaks and groans of the old house seemed louder, more deliberate, as though something was moving through the walls. The first night without him was the longest I had ever experienced. I lay awake in my bed, listening for any sound that might indicate danger. My hand wrapped around the small knife I had taken from the kitchen. Every creak of the floorboard set my heart racing. Every gust of wind against the windows sounded like a ghost trying to get in. I thought about what Julian had said, about the woman he had failed to save. Had she spent nights like this, alone and afraid, wondering if each shadow concealed her death? Had she called out for help that never came? Had she prayed for morning with the same desperate fervor I found myself praying now? When dawn finally broke, weak and watery through my curtains, I was exhausted but alive. I rose, dressed, and went about my duties with a determination that surprised even myself. I would not cower. I would not hide. If someone meant to harm me, they would find me ready. The days passed in a strange rhythm of anxiety and routine. I answered correspondence. I met with solicitors about Edmund's estate. I conducted interviews with household merchants and supervised the endless work of maintaining a great house. And always, beneath the surface of ordinary life, I watched and waited and wondered. Lady Philippa watched me in return. I caught her eyes on me constantly, felt her attention like a weight pressing against my skin. She said little, but her silence spoke volumes. She knew I suspected her of something. She knew I was waiting for Julian's return, and she was waiting too, though for what, I could not guess. On the 5th night of Julian's absence, something happened that nearly broke my resolve. I had retired early, exhausted from a day of meetings and paperwork. Sleep came quickly, a mercy I had not expected, and I drifted into dreams that were, for once, peaceful. I dreamed of summer, of sunshine and green fields, of a life unburdened by fear. I woke suddenly, completely, as though someone had shaken me from sleep. The room was dark except for the faint glow of dying embers in the fireplace. I lay still, my heart pounding, straining to hear whatever sound had woken me. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, approaching my door from the corridor outside. I reached for the knife beneath my pillow, my fingers closing around the handle with a grip that whitened my knuckles. The footsteps stopped. A long moment of silence, and then, slowly, impossibly, the door began to open. I screamed. I could not help it. The sound tore from my throat with a force that surprised me, and I scrambled back against the headboard, raising the knife with both hands. The door opened fully, and a figure stepped into the room. For one wild, impossible moment, I saw Adelaide standing there, her golden hair loose around her shoulders, her violet eyes burning with accusation. But it was not Adelaide. It was Mrs. Blackwood. Her gray hair unpinned, her face pale with alarm. "Madam," she cried, rushing to my bedside. "Madam, what is wrong? I heard you screaming. I came as fast as I could." I stared at her, my heart still racing, my breath coming in ragged gasps. "The door," I managed. Someone was at the door. Mrs. Blackwood turned to look at the door, which stood open to the dark corridor beyond. "Madam," she said carefully, "I was the one at the door. I heard sounds from your room, and I came to check on you. When I tried to enter, I found the door stuck. I had to push hard to open it. I closed my eyes, trying to calm my racing thoughts. Had I imagined the slow, deliberate approach? Had my fear transformed Mrs. Blackwood's innocent concern into something sinister? "I am sorry," I said. "I have been sleeping poorly. The strain of recent events. I must have been dreaming." Mrs. Blackwood's expression was sympathetic, but I saw something else in her eyes, worry, perhaps, or doubt. "Let me bring you some warm milk," she said. "It will help you sleep." She left, and I sat alone in my dark chamber, the knife still clutched in my hands. I was losing my grip on reality. The fear was doing what the warnings had not managed to do. It was destroying me from within. When Mrs. Blackwood returned with the milk, I drank it gratefully and allowed her to tuck the blankets around me like a mother with a child. She did not speak, but her presence was a comfort, a reminder that I was not entirely alone. But as I drifted back towards sleep, one thought remained lodged in my mind like a splinter. Someone had been in the corridor outside my room. Someone had been trying to enter. Whether it was Mrs. Blackwood or someone else, the footsteps I had heard were real. The dead were not the only ones watching me. I tried to occupy myself with correspondence and household management, the endless small tasks that fell to the mistress of a great house. But my mind kept returning to Julian, wondering what he was discovering, whether he was safe, when he would return. I told myself this preoccupation was natural, that I was simply anxious for news, eager to have the mystery resolved. But I knew, in the deepest part of myself, that my feelings had grown beyond mere professional concern. I was falling in love with him. The realization struck me one gray afternoon as I sat in the library, pretending to read while rain streaked down the windows. I loved the way he listened when I spoke. I loved the way his eyes lit up when he made a connection between disparate facts. I loved his quiet determination, his refusal to accept easy answers, his unwavering belief in my sanity when I was beginning to doubt it myself. I loved his voice, low and thoughtful, and the rare smile that transformed his serious face into something almost boyish. I loved him wholly and completely, in a way I had never loved Edmund, in a way I had not known I was capable of loving anyone. And it was impossible. I was a widow. He was an investigator I had hired. The scandal of his presence in my house was already spreading through London. If anyone suspected the true nature of my feelings, I would be ruined beyond all hope of redemption. More than that, I had no reason to believe he felt anything for me beyond professional respect. He was courteous, attentive, protective, but these were qualities he might have shown to any client. I was foolish to imagine they meant something more. Lady Philippa found me in the library that afternoon, staring out at the rain with tears I could not explain streaking down my cheeks. "Crying for your dead husband," she said, and her voice held no sympathy, only cold observation, or crying for something else entirely. I wiped my face and composed myself as best I could. "I am merely tired, Lady Philippa. The strain of recent weeks has been considerable." She settled herself in the chair across from mine, her ancient bones creaking almost as loudly as the floorboards. "I have been watching you, Helena. Watching you and that man you have brought into this house. Do you know what the servants are saying? Do you know what all of London is saying?" "I imagine I do," I replied evenly, "and I find I do not care." Her eyes narrowed. "You should care. Reputation is the only currency a woman possesses. Once lost, it cannot be regained. Your position in this house, your inheritance, your very future depends upon maintaining the appearance of propriety." "My future depends upon staying alive," I said. "And Mr. Vance is helping me do that." "Is he?" Lady Philippa leaned forward, and I saw something in her expression that I could not quite read. "Or is he the danger himself, wrapped in pleasant packaging? A man appears from nowhere, insinuates himself into your confidence, convinces you that you are under threat from mysterious forces only he can combat. It is an old strategy, Helena. I have seen it employed before. You are suggesting that Mr. Vance is a fraud? That he is the one threatening me? I am suggesting that you should consider all possibilities." Lady Philippa rose, leaning heavily on her cane. "I have lived in this house for 60 years. I have seen many things, many secrets, many lies, and I have learned that the most dangerous enemies are the ones who present themselves as friends." She left me alone with my confusion and my doubt. Was she right? Was I being manipulated by the very man I had come to trust, to love? Had Julian Vance orchestrated the threats against me, creating a crisis only he could solve, making himself indispensable so that he might, what? Marry me for my fortune? Take control of my life, as Edmund once had? The suspicion poisoned everything. I found myself reviewing every conversation we had shared, every glance, every touch, searching for evidence of deception. But I could find nothing. His kindness had seemed genuine. His concern had seemed real. And yet Lady Philippa's words echoed in my mind, a warning I could not ignore. When Julian returned from Yorkshire a week later, I was determined to maintain my distance. He found me in the morning room, going through household accounts with a concentration I did not truly feel. His face was drawn with exhaustion from the journey, but his eyes were bright with discovery. "I have learned things," he said, sitting down across from me without waiting for an invitation. "Important things. Geoffrey Ashworth is in dire financial straits. His estate is mortgaged to the hilt, his investments have failed, and his creditors are circling. He needs money desperately, and your death would provide it. This should have been welcome news. It confirmed what we had suspected, gave us a clear suspect, a motive, a direction for our investigation. But I found myself pulling back, guarding myself against the warmth his presence always inspired. "That is useful information," I said coolly. "Thank you for obtaining it." He noticed the change in my manner immediately. His brow furrowed, and he studied me with the same intensity he brought to his investigations. "Mrs. Ashworth, is something wrong?" "Nothing is wrong. I simply think it best that we maintain appropriate professional boundaries." "Professional boundaries," he repeated, and something flickered in his amber eyes. Surprise, perhaps, or hurt. "Have I done something to offend you?" "No." I could not look at him. If I looked at him, I would weaken, and I could not afford to weaken. I have simply been reminded that, that our association has already generated considerable gossip. I cannot afford further damage to my reputation." "I see." His voice had gone flat, carefully neutral. "You are right, of course. I apologize if my presence has caused you difficulty." He rose, and I heard him move toward the door. Every step felt like a wound, like watching something precious slip through my fingers. But I held myself rigid, staring down at the accounts that blurred before my eyes. "Mrs. Ashworth." I looked up. He stood in the doorway, silhouetted against the gray light of the corridor, his expression unreadable. "Whatever you have been told about me," he said quietly, "whatever doubts have been planted in your mind, I want you to know that my only concern has been your safety. Nothing more." "I would never," his voice caught, and he paused to collect himself. "I would never do anything to hurt you." He was gone before I could respond. That night I dreamed of Adelaide. She stood at the foot of my bed, her golden hair unbound, her violet eyes fixed on mine with an intensity that felt like drowning. She did not speak, but I understood her nonetheless. She was trying to tell me something, warn me of something, show me a truth I could not yet see. I woke, gasping, my heart pounding, my nightgown damp with sweat. The room was dark, except for the faint glow of dying embers in the fireplace, and there in the corner was a figure. I screamed. The figure moved, stepped forward into the ember light, and I saw that it was Julian. He wore a dressing gown over his shirt, and his feet were bare, and his face was pale with alarm. "I heard you cry out," he said. I feared that something had happened. Forgive me, I should not have entered without permission, but the door was unlocked and I was afraid. My terror subsided, replaced by a different kind of agitation. Awareness of his presence in my bedchamber, awareness of my own state of undress, awareness of how easily scandal could bloom from this single moment. "You must leave," I said, "if anyone sees you here." "I know." He did not move. "Mrs. Ashworth, Helena, please, tell me what has changed between us. Tell me what I have done to lose your trust." My name in his mouth undid something in me. The careful walls I had constructed began to crumble. "Lady Philippa," I whispered. "She suggested that you might be the one threatening me, that you created this crisis to make yourself necessary." His expression shifted through several emotions, disbelief, hurt, and finally a weary understanding. "Of course she did. She has spent her entire life protecting this family and its secrets. She sees threats everywhere. Is she wrong?" He came closer, close enough that I could see the shadows under his eyes, the stubble on his jaw, the rapid pulse beating in his throat. "I have been an investigator for 10 years, he said. In that time, I have been accused of many things. Charlatanry, fraud, even murder once, though the charges were eventually dropped. I have learned to accept that suspicion follows me like a shadow. That does not answer my question." "No." He took a breath. "It does not. So let me answer directly. I am not threatening you. I have not created this crisis. And I have not," his voice dropped lower, almost to a whisper, "I have not pretended affection to gain your trust." The word hung between us, heavy with implication. "Affection." "I should not have said that," he continued, turning away. "I apologize. It was inappropriate. Julian." He stopped, his back to me, his shoulders tense. "I do not want you to apologize," I said. "I want you to tell me the truth. All of it." He turned back to face me, and in the dim light, I saw something raw and unguarded in his expression, something that made my breath catch in my throat. "The truth," he said slowly, "is that I came to this house as an investigator. I intended to solve your mystery, collect my fee, and move on to the next case. That is how I have always worked. That is the only way I know how to work. But from the moment I met you, from the moment you looked at me with those gray eyes and told me your impossible story, something changed. I found myself thinking about you when I should have been thinking about the case. I found myself watching for your smile, listening for your voice, counting the hours until I could see you again. I told myself it was nothing, that I was merely invested in the work, but it was a lie. He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice was barely audible. I am in love with you, Helena, and I know that it is impossible, that you are a widow in mourning, that I am no one of importance, that the world would never sanction what I feel. But you asked for the truth, and I find I cannot lie to you. Not anymore. I do not remember moving. I do not remember making a conscious decision. But suddenly I was standing before him, close enough to touch, close enough to see the rapid rise and fall of his chest. It is not impossible, I said, and I am not in mourning. I never loved Edmund. I was his wife, but I was never his in any way that mattered. And now I find that I am. I stumbled over the words, so foreign, so terrifying. I find that I am yours, Julian, if you will have me. He did not speak. He simply reached out and cupped my face in his hands, his touch gentle, almost reverent, and then he kissed me. It was nothing like the kisses I had shared with Edmund, perfunctory and cold, obligations to be endured rather than pleasures to be savored. Julian kissed me as though I were the answer to a question he had been asking his entire life. His lips were soft, his breath warm, his hands trembling slightly where they rested against my skin. I felt myself melting into him, felt the walls I had built crumbling into dust, felt for the first time in my life what it meant to be truly, completely wanted. When we finally pulled apart, both of us breathless, he rested his forehead against mine. We should not have done that, he said. No, I agreed. We should not have. I am going to kiss you again. Yes, please. We did not become lovers that night. Despite the passion that blazed between us, Julian pulled back before we went too far, reminding me that we were still in danger, that there was still a mystery to solve, that we could not afford to be distracted by our feelings. He was right, of course. He was always right. But everything had changed. When I woke the next morning, the world looked different. Brighter somehow, despite the perpetual gray of London winter. More hopeful. I dressed and went down to breakfast with a smile on my face that I could not suppress, a smile that earned me a sharp look from Lady Philippa and a knowing nod from Mrs. Blackwood. Julian was already at work when I found him in the library, surrounded by papers and books and maps of the house. He looked up when I entered, and the smile that crossed his face was like sunlight breaking through clouds. I believe I have found something, he said. Come, look at this. He had discovered a set of architectural plans, yellowed with age, showing the original layout of Ashworth Manor. And there, hidden behind the walls of the gallery where Adelaide's portrait hung, was a space that did not appear on any modern plan of the house, a secret room. We went together to investigate, armed with candles and crowbars and the kind of reckless courage that comes from having nothing left to lose. The entrance was concealed behind a false panel, so cleverly constructed that I had walked past it hundreds of times without ever suspecting its existence. Inside, we found a narrow staircase descending into darkness. The room at the bottom was small and dusty, filled with objects that told a terrible story. A woman's hairbrush with strands of golden hair still caught in the bristles. A journal written in a feminine hand, documenting a marriage that had turned into a prison. Letters, similar to the ones we had found in Edmund's desk, begging for rescue, for escape, for anyone to hear and understand. And, propped against the far wall, a portrait. Adelaide, but not the Adelaide who hung in the gallery above. This Adelaide was older, tired, her violet eyes haunted by a knowledge she could not escape. This was Adelaide as she had looked near the end, I realized, before the fever, before the silence. Julian examined the room with the methodical care he brought to everything, photographing the contents, taking notes, piecing together the narrative of what had happened here. And I read the journal, each page more horrifying than the last. Adelaide had discovered something. Something about Edmund, about his business dealings, about the source of his wealth. She had found evidence that he had committed crimes, terrible crimes, and she had threatened to expose him. The secret room had been her prison in the final months of her life, a place where Edmund kept her hidden while he decided what to do. And then, according to her final, shaky entries, she had stopped writing altogether. She did not die of fever, I said, my voice hollow. He killed her. It appears so, Julian replied grimly. Edmund kept her here, isolated from anyone who might help her, until he found a way to silence her permanently. The physician who signed her death certificate must have been in his employ. But that was 15 years ago. Edmund is dead. Why am I being threatened now? Because, a new voice said from the doorway, some secrets refuse to stay buried. We spun around. Standing at the entrance to the secret room, her cane clutched in one gnarled hand, was Lady Philippa. Her face was pale, her eyes bright with an emotion I could not name. You have found Adelaide's prison, she said. I wondered if you would. I wondered if anyone ever would. You knew about this? Julian demanded. Lady Philippa moved into the room, her movements slow but deliberate. I knew many things, Mr. Vance. I knew that Edmund was not the man he pretended to be. I knew that Adelaide had learned his secrets. I knew that she had to be silenced. My blood ran cold. You knew he murdered her. I knew he had no choice. Lady Philippa's voice was calm, almost conversational. Adelaide was going to destroy everything, the family, the fortune, all of it. She did not understand that some truths are too dangerous to speak. Edmund did what was necessary to protect us all. Including you, Julian said. His hand had moved to his pocket, where I knew he kept a small pistol. You were complicit in her death. I was complicit in her silence. There is a difference. Lady Philippa fixed her rheumy eyes on me. And now you, Helena, have stumbled into the same trap. You have learned things you should not know. You have stirred up ghosts that should have remained buried. And someone must decide what to do about you. It is you, I breathed, understanding dawning with terrible clarity. You are the one who has been threatening me. The ink, the messages, the warnings. You wanted to frighten me away before I discovered the truth. I wanted to give you a chance to leave, Lady Philippa corrected. I did not want to hurt you, Helena. I had hoped that you would take the warnings for what they were and go, quietly, without asking questions. But you refused to be frightened. You brought this man into the house, and now you have found what should never have been found. She raised her cane, and I saw that the handle concealed a blade, thin and sharp and deadly. Julian stepped in front of me, his pistol drawn. Put it down, he said. It is over, Lady Philippa. The truth is known. Killing us will not change that. The truth, Lady Philippa said with a bitter smile, is whatever the powerful decide it shall be. Edmund understood that. I understand it. And soon you will understand it too. You helped him kill Adelaide, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. You helped him hide her body, cover up the crime, and then you spent 15 years living in this house, walking past her portrait, pretending nothing had happened. Lady Philippa's eyes flashed. You think you understand, but you understand nothing. Adelaide was going to destroy everything. Everything this family had built over generations. She found documents, letters, evidence of transactions that should never have been recorded. She was going to take it to the authorities, to the newspapers, to anyone who would listen. What transactions? Julian demanded. What was Edmund involved in? Lady Philippa laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. What was he not involved in? Arms dealing, smuggling. The trade in human beings. The fortune you inherited, Mrs. Ashworth, was built on the backs of slaves and the blood of innocents. Adelaide discovered that truth, and she could not bear it. She was too good, too pure, too naive. She thought that exposing Edmund would somehow set things right. But you stopped her, I said. I gave Edmund a choice. Lady Philippa's voice was cold. He could let Adelaide destroy the family, or he could stop her. He chose to stop her. He murdered her. He did what was necessary. Lady Philippa raised her blade, just as I will do what is necessary now. She lunged toward us with surprising speed for a woman of her age. Julian fired, the shot deafening in the enclosed space. Lady Philippa staggered, clutched at her shoulder, and fell. She lay on the floor of the secret room, her blood seeping into the dust of decades, her eyes still burning with defiance. Julian kept his pistol trained on her while I retrieved the blade that had fallen from her hand. My own hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold it. "It is over," Julian said, his voice hoarse. "It is finally over." But Lady Philippa was laughing, a wet, gasping sound that sent chills down my spine. "Over," she repeated. "Nothing is over. The secrets will survive. They always survive. Kill me if you wish. The truth will still rot inside you." I knelt beside her, my face close to hers. "The truth is what will set us free," I said. "The truth is what Adelaide deserved, what I deserve, what everyone you and Edmund destroyed deserved." For a moment, something flickered in Lady Philippa's eyes, something that might have been regret, or might have been recognition, or might have been nothing more than the light of Julian's candle reflecting in her pupils. And then she closed her eyes and said nothing more. I will not describe what followed in detail. The police were summoned. Lady Philippa was taken into custody, her wound treated, her confession recorded. The secret room was photographed and catalogued, its contents entered into evidence. The story of Adelaide's murder, so long concealed, was finally brought into the light. The investigation that followed was thorough and brutal. Every aspect of Edmund's business dealings was examined, every transaction traced, every crime catalogued. The documents Adelaide had discovered were recovered from a hidden compartment in Edmund's study, and they revealed horrors that exceeded even what Lady Philippa had admitted. Edmund had been involved not only in smuggling and arms dealing, but in a network of corruption that stretched across the empire. Politicians, magistrates, even members of the aristocracy had been complicit in his crimes. The scandal that erupted when the truth became public threatened to bring down some of the most powerful families in England. Through it all, Julian remained by my side. He helped me navigate the endless interviews with police inspectors and journalists. He shielded me from the worst of the public scrutiny. He held me at night when the nightmares came, as they often did. When I woke sweating and shaking from dreams of Adelaide's ghost and Lady Philippa's blade. There were moments when I doubted everything, when I wondered if I had made a terrible mistake in exposing the truth. The fortune I had inherited was tainted beyond redemption. The name I carried was now synonymous with murder and corruption. I could have remained silent, could have accepted my inheritance without question, could have lived out my days in ignorant luxury. But I knew that I could never have lived with myself if I had made that choice. Adelaide's ghost had asked for justice, and I had given it to her. Whatever else happened, whatever else I lost, that knowledge sustained me. Geoffrey Ashworth, we learned, had known nothing of the truth. His desperate financial situation was genuine, his desire to inherit the estate real, but he had not been responsible for the threats against me. He arrived from Yorkshire white-faced and shaking when he heard the news, and for the first time since I had known him, he spoke to me with something approaching kindness. "I am sorry," he said. "I am sorry for what my brother did, for what our aunt helped him conceal. I am sorry that you were drawn into this nightmare. It was not your fault," I told him. And I found, somewhat to my surprise, that I meant it. Lady Philippa died in prison 3 months later, before she could be brought to trial. The official cause was heart failure, but I believe she simply chose not to continue living in a world where her secrets had been exposed. She had spent her entire life protecting the Ashworth name, and in the end, it was her own actions that had destroyed it. And what of me? What of Julian? The scandal, when it broke, was everything we had feared and more. A widow, an investigator, a secret room, a murder, a confession. The newspapers had a feast. My name was dragged through every drawing room in London, whispered and exclaimed and dissected by people who had never met me and never would. The respectable families who had once invited me to their parties closed their doors. The suitors who had begun circling, attracted by my youth and my fortune, vanished like morning mist. I found that I did not care. Julian and I married 6 months after Lady Philippa's death, in a small ceremony attended only by a handful of people who had stood by us through everything. Mrs. Blackwood wept with joy. Geoffrey, improbably, served as a witness. And I, standing before the altar in a gown of pale grey silk, looked into the amber eyes of the man I loved and spoke vows that I meant with every fibre of my being. The morning of our wedding dawned clear and bright, the first truly sunny day London had seen in weeks. I took it as a sign, though whether of heaven's blessing or simply of the arbitrary kindness of weather, I could not say. Mrs. Blackwood helped me dress, her rough hands gentle as she fastened the long row of buttons at my back. "You look beautiful, madam," she said, and there were tears in her eyes. "The master would be," she stopped, uncertain how to complete the thought. I took her hands in mine. "Edmund was not a good man," I said gently. "We both know that now. But whatever happiness I find from this day forward, you will always be part of it. You believed in me when no one else did. You kept my secrets. You helped me survive." Mrs. Blackwood squeezed my hands, her weathered face crumpling with emotion. "I only did what any decent person would do," she said. "You deserved so much better than what you got in this house, and now, finally, you have found it." The ceremony was held in a small chapel in Bloomsbury, far from the fashionable churches where society weddings took place. The pews were nearly empty, our handful of guests scattered across the wooden seats like survivors of some great disaster, which in a way, we were. Julian stood at the altar, his usual composure cracked by visible nervousness. He wore a simple dark suit, his hair neatly combed, his amber eyes bright with emotion. When he saw me walking toward him down the aisle, his face transformed. Joy, disbelief, wonder, all of it passed across his features in quick succession before settling into an expression of such profound love that I felt my knees go weak. We spoke our vows in voices that trembled with emotion. I promised to love, honor, and cherish. He promised the same. And when the minister pronounced us husband and wife, Julian kissed me with a tenderness that made me forget where we were, who was watching, what had brought us to this moment. Afterward, we gathered at a small inn near the chapel for a modest wedding breakfast. Mrs. Blackwood had insisted on preparing the food herself, and she had outdone herself with roast beef and fresh bread, with tarts and cakes and all manner of delicacies that reminded me of the family celebrations I had dreamed of as a girl but had rarely experienced. Geoffrey raised a toast to our happiness, his voice rough with emotion. And even Mary, the young housemaid who had told us about the mysterious light in the gallery, had been invited and sat beaming at the table as though she were watching a fairy tale come true. It was, in its own quiet way, the happiest day of my life. We did not stay at Ashworth Manor. The house held too many ghosts, too many memories, too much pain. I sold it to an American industrialist who cared nothing for its history and everything for its grandeur. He planned to modernize it, he told me, to install gas lighting and indoor plumbing and all the latest conveniences. I wished him well and did not look back as our carriage pulled away for the final time. With the proceeds, Julian and I purchased a modest townhouse in Bloomsbury where we could live quietly, away from the glare of scandal and the weight of the past. Our new home was nothing like Ashworth Manor. It was small, just 8 rooms spread across 3 floors with a narrow garden in the back and a front door that opened directly onto a busy street. The furniture was comfortable rather than grand, the decorations simple rather than ostentatious. There were no portraits of stern ancestors staring down from the walls, no secret rooms concealing terrible truths. I loved it more than I had ever loved any place in my life. Julian and I settled into a routine that was both ordinary and extraordinary. We ate breakfast together each morning, lingering over tea and newspapers and easy conversation. We worked together during the days, Julian on his investigations, and I on the research that increasingly supported his work. We dined together each evening, sometimes alone, and sometimes with the small circle of friends we had begun to gather, people who valued honesty over appearance, substance over style. And at night, in the quiet darkness of our bedchamber, we discovered together what it meant to love without fear. I had never known that kind of intimacy before. With Edmund, the marriage bed had been a duty to be endured, a cold and mechanical act devoid of affection or pleasure. But with Julian, everything was different. He touched me as though I were precious, as though my pleasure mattered more than his own, as though the simple act of holding me was a gift he did not deserve. And I, who had spent so many years numb to my own desires, discovered capacities for joy and passion that I had never suspected existed. One evening, perhaps a year after our wedding, Julian came home from a meeting with a potential client looking troubled. I was in the parlor, reading by lamplight, and I set aside my book when I saw his expression. "What is wrong?" I asked. He sat down across from me, his amber eyes dark with thought. "The client," he said slowly. "She is a young widow. Her husband died recently, and strange things have been happening in her house. Sounds in the night, objects moving on their own. She believes she is being haunted." My heart contracted. "You think of Adelaide," I said. "I think of you." He reached out and took my hand. "I think of how frightened you were when you first came to me, how alone you felt, how desperate you were for someone to believe you. And I wonder if I am doing the right thing, involving myself in cases like this. You saved my life," I reminded him. "You discovered the truth. You brought a murderer to justice. Yes, but I also put you in danger. If I had not investigated, if I had simply told you that there was nothing to find, Lady Philippa might never have felt threatened enough to act against you. Or she might have found another way to silence me. Or I might have spent the rest of my life haunted by questions I could not answer." I squeezed his hand. "Julian, what you do matters. The people who come to you are frightened and alone just as I was. They deserve to have their fears taken seriously, their mysteries investigated, their truths uncovered. Even if it puts them in danger? Even then, better to face danger with open eyes than to cower in ignorance." He was silent for a long moment, and then he smiled, that rare, full smile that I had come to treasure more than any jewel or fortune. "You are remarkable, Helena Vance. Have I told you that lately?" "Not since this morning," I said, smiling back. "But you may tell me again." He rose, crossed to where I sat, and kissed me with a tenderness that still, after all this time, made my breath catch. "I love you," he murmured against my lips. "I love you more than I have words to express." "Then stop talking," I said, and pulled him down beside me. Julian continues his work as an investigator, though now I serve as his partner rather than his client. Together, we explore the mysteries that others fear to touch, the questions that respectable society prefers to ignore. We have found again and again that the line between the natural and the supernatural is thinner than most people wish to believe. There have been cases that tested our courage and our commitment to each other. A haunted theater in the West End where a vengeful spirit had claimed 3 lives. A scientist whose experiments in mesmerism had gone terribly, horribly wrong. A séance gone wrong. A cursed jewel. A family destroyed by a secret that should never have been kept. Each case taught us something new about the world, about the nature of fear and grief and the lengths people will go to protect their secrets. And each case brought us closer together, forged our partnership into something stronger than either of us had expected. I remember one particular investigation, about 2 years after our wedding, that nearly broke us both. A young woman had come to Julian with a terrifying story. Her sister had died under mysterious circumstances, and now the dead sister's husband was courting her, pressing her to marry him, to take her sister's place in his bed and in his life. She believed her sister's spirit was trying to warn her, to tell her something about the circumstances of her death. The case struck too close to home for me. I saw echoes of Adelaide in the dead sister, echoes of myself in the young woman who had come to us for help. Julian saw it too, and he hesitated before taking the case, asking me if I was certain I could handle the memories it might stir up. "I am certain," I told him, "and if I falter, you will be there to catch me." He was, as always, as good as his word. We investigated together, uncovered a truth that was as ugly as we had feared, and brought a murderer to justice. The young woman was safe. Her sister's spirit, if indeed it had been her sister, was at peace. And I, though shaken by the memories the case had awakened, emerged stronger for having faced them. That is what Julian has given me, beyond love, beyond partnership, beyond the simple comfort of having someone beside me in the darkness. He has given me the courage to face my fears, to look directly at the shadows that once paralyzed me, to believe that I am capable of more than I ever imagined. Sometimes, late at night, when the candles burn low and the shadows gather in the corners of our little house, I think about Adelaide. I think about her fear, her loneliness, her desperate hope that someone would discover the truth. She has been at peace since her story was finally told. I have not seen her ghost since the night of my dream, have not felt her presence, have not sensed her watching from the shadows. But I like to believe that she is grateful, wherever she is now. I like to believe that she knows her death was not in vain. And the words that haunted me for so long, the warning written in moving ink, the threat that seemed to promise my death. I understand now that they were not a curse, but a gift. Adelaide was trying to tell me what she herself had never had the chance to say. That danger was near, that someone in the house meant me harm, that I was next in line to learn the terrible truth that had been hidden for so long. I was next, but I survived. I found love where I least expected it, justice where it seemed impossible, and peace where I had known only fear. The ink on Edmund's will never moved again. The document sits in a locked drawer of my desk, a reminder of everything I have escaped. Sometimes I take it out and read it, running my fingers over the words that once transformed before my eyes. The ink stays still now. The paper is ordinary. Whatever power Adelaide's spirit once had, it has been spent. But I know the truth. I know what lies beneath the surface of polite society, the secrets and lies, the cruelty and greed, the willingness of the powerful to sacrifice the innocent for their own protection. I know that the dead do not always stay silent, that the truth cannot always be suppressed, that love can bloom even in the darkest places. My name is Helena Vance. I was the greedy widow, they said. The fortune hunter, the woman who married for money and got more than she bargained for. But I am not that woman. I never was. I am simply someone who refused to be frightened into silence, who demanded answers that others were afraid to give, who found in the search for truth something infinitely more precious than any fortune. I found myself. And in finding myself, I found the courage to open my heart to a love I never imagined possible. Julian sleeps beside me as I write these words, his breathing slow and steady in the darkness. He is my partner, my protector, my dearest friend. He saw me when no one else would look, believed me when no one else would listen, loved me when I had forgotten what it meant to be loved. The candle is burning low. Soon I will put down my pen and join him in sleep, secure in the knowledge that I am safe, that the mystery is solved, that the dead have finally found peace. But before I do, I want to say this, to anyone who might someday read these words and find in them an echo of their own fear, their own loneliness, their own desperate hope. Do not let them silence you. Do not let them define who you are. Do not let the darkness win. The ink may move, the ghosts may whisper, the world may turn against you. But if you hold fast to the truth, if you refuse to be afraid, if you open your heart to the possibility of love, even when it seems impossible, you will find your way through. I did. Against all odds, against all expectation, against everything the world tried to make me believe about myself, I found my way through. And now, at last, I am home. The city sleeps outside my window, London with all its fog and gaslight and secrets. Somewhere out there, other women lie awake in the darkness, trapped in marriages they never wanted, haunted by fears they cannot name, waiting for someone to believe them, to help them, to save them. I think of them often, these invisible women, and I wish I could reach across the miles and tell them what I have learned. You are not alone. You are not mad. You are not weak. You are stronger than you know, braver than you believe, more valuable than anyone has ever told you. And if the ink begins to move, if the ghosts begin to whisper, if the world begins to shift beneath your feet, do not be afraid. It may be a warning. It may be a gift. It may be the beginning of a story you never expected to live. My story began with a will and ended with a wedding. It began with fear and ended with love. It began with death and ended with the most profound, the most unexpected, the most transformative life I could have imagined. I am Helena Vance, and I am finally, truly, completely alive. And now, at last, I am home.